Thank you, Iman, and welcome everybody. It's my distinct honor to welcome our first Baumer lecturer of this term by way of introducing her to you this evening. As you know, Elisa Iturbe is assistant professor at the Cooper Union. Iturbe also teaches courses on fossil capitalism and carbon modernity at the Yale School of Architecture and at Cornell. She received a dual master's from the Yale School of Environment and the Yale School of Architecture, where she subsequently served as coordinator of the same joint program. I was introduced to Professor Iturbe's work by Tatiana Bilbao, who guided us last semester to her editorship of Log number 47. The issue, which also includes her excellent introductory essay, has a plethora of important contemporary research on climate. Bilbao's international architecture practice addresses climate realities. She's driven by collaboration and listening. She's inspired by the realities of the human condition and is deeply committed to the social local. One can readily see the inspiration provided by Iturbe's research to a practice similar to that of Bilbao. Iturbe faces head-on the conundrum of carbon production by modern and contemporary architecture and the polemic of architecture's ties to capitalist production. She succinctly synthesizes modern history to show that we face a multifaceted problem and architecture's ties to systems of economics, politics, ecology, and energy logistics. She links form and energy to expose architecture's entanglements with power. Efforts to find a viable solution to carbon form must begin beyond abstract form to understand more deeply the forms and catalysts of production. Therein, she suggests that we may identify a new form of architectural agency. And as she has written, while modernism as a cultural ideology did die indeed, we have failed to notice that the necessary death has not yet come. For carbon modernity has not yet died. And as Walter Benjamin has said of capitalism, it will not die a natural death. Iturbe has written about the relationship between energy, power, and form. She's co-founder of Outside Development, a design and research practice, and she's been widely published in AA Files, Log, Perspecta, the New York Review of Architecture, and Antagonismos. I believe because her work is of such current importance to both applied and theoretical architecture and allied fields, she's here at a very critical time for us. And Iturbe wrote a book with Peter Eisenman titled Lateness. She's apparently willing to train anybody. Even old dogs can learn new tricks. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. I feel like I don't have to say anything anymore. I can just go. But this is my first time at the Knowlton School, and so I'm extremely happy to be here. I have to say, I feel as though I know this place. Not only have I known and worked with many graduates of this school, but having spent a lot of time with Peter Eisenman, I've heard tell of many a cold, gray day on the banks of the Olentangy. So in any case, it's an honor to be part of this lecture series, and I'm thrilled to be part of a conversation about the commons. So I'm going to start by perhaps defining what I mean by commons. Most commonly, you will hear the commons referred to as a resource, either cultural or natural, that is accessible to all members of society. More broadly, we might think about this as air, water, things like this, things that for one reason or another we believe should be made available to many. But I'm not going to use this definition of the commons today, in part because I want to use something a little bit more specific. And I'll draw from two thinkers here to bring a little bit more specificity to the definition. Starting with Elinor Ostrom, who is an economist. She won a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on the commons. And she's done a lot of work to clarify what the commons are. And she's very clear that the commons should not be confused with what we might call open access, right? So things that are loosely shared, things that are unowned and made available because they are unowned, and in that sense, they're thought of as ripe for the taking. Ostrom and many others argue that commons are not just defined by the presence of a shared resource or perhaps the possibility of sharing something, but that the commons are defined instead by self-governance relative to a specific resource. So let's dig into that a little bit and maybe start again with a different definition. Thinking of the commons instead as a social practice where a community of users self-govern and manage a resource. So notice that the word resource here moves to the end of the sentence, and what we now lead in with is the concept of a social practice. Another amazing theorist of the commons is Massimo De Angelis. He has a book titled Omnia sunt communia, which in Latin means everything is common. This is an excellent book that works to define the commons and to understand how they work. And he writes that commoning is about people coming together to produce common goods. And what are common goods? He defines them as something that has a use value for a plurality. In other words, these are objects that have social value. They satisfy socially determined needs, desires, and aspirations. Now, we should note that there are plenty of examples of things that meet social needs: airport lounges, trains, parks, the street. But these are not actually the commons that he's trying to define. Because his problem with those examples is that people there are mostly passive users of those goods. And for De Angelis, the commons have to involve some kind of active participation. So he writes, to make a common good, the plurality needs to come alive as a plurality of commoners by claiming ownership of that good. And to do this, the plurality cannot be passive. They must govern the production, the reproduction, the sustainability, and the development of that good. So what does that mean? That there's an active relationship between people and goods, and that the goods are not delivered simply to a passive public, but rather that people are actively working to produce and reproduce and steward and govern these things. So the plurality is shaping its relationship to that good and to the environment in which that good is produced. So there are plenty of examples, and Massimo De Angelis' book is full of examples, but from barn raisings by the Amish to labor cooperatives in indigenous South America that manage the distribution of water in their communities, to systems of mutual aid that feed the needy. There are many, many examples throughout the world. Now, you might ask, why is this an architectural question? These are obviously socio-political configurations. They're dependent on participation, on willingness, and the consent of a community. And to think that architecture can somehow produce these commons by making people work in this way, or asking people to live in this way, can be considered at best idealist and at worst arrogant. But I'm deliberately framing the question in the wrong way, because I don't think that this is about what architecture can make people do. Rather, it's what architecture might allow people to do. Because all architectural and urban configurations allow certain kinds of movement and juxtapositions and disallow others. And in this sense, I would argue that the link between architecture and the commons is in many ways a formal one, because the way in which architecture and the city can support the commons is by creating spatial and formal configurations that allow and support the cooperation in question. So in other words, to think about the commons relative to architectural design is not just a question of finding different program for a building or finding different clients. I think that this is a larger question for the discipline of architecture, which has in a way something to do with how we think about form. I don't believe that the socio-political and the formal pertain to different realms, that one is disciplinary and inward-facing, and that the other has nothing to do with the formal questions we discuss as architects. And in fact, I'd say that it's not a reach at all to say that form simply is political. There's a long tradition of thinking about this in theory. Power and space has been explicitly theorized, at least since Foucault, of course, earlier than that as well, resulting in an amazing spatial turn within the humanities that has led to some amazing theory. But this is not specific to social theory or political theory, and it's not foreign to architecture. We need to look no further than to Peter Eisenman, who said that architecture is, in essence, the giving of form to intent, function, structure, and techniques, which means that form is not isolated from other basic aspects of human relations. We might also turn to Pier Vittorio Aureli, who writes, "We can argue that the formal indicates a decision on how the inside relates to the outside, and how the latter is delineated from within. The formal essentially involves an act of spatial determination, of delimitation. It is fundamentally relational." We can also look to Caroline Levine, who I know also participated in this lecture series. She writes, "Form always indicates an arrangement of elements, an ordering, patterning, or shaping. It is the work of form to make order. And that means that forms are the stuff of politics. And if the political is a matter of imposing and enforcing boundaries, temporal patterns, and hierarchies of experience, then there is no politics without form." So I think there are three important things here. One is that an act of architecture is an act of giving form. Two, form is always relational. And three, power has form. So because of this, architectural form, I think one could argue, is always political. But the point I'm trying to make is not necessarily this. My point is that once we understand this link between space and power, between politics and form, then we have to ask what it means for architecture today. And I don't need to convince anyone today that we're at a crossroads. We know this. I don't have to repeat the horrifying data points about rising temperatures, rising seas, extreme weather, species extinction. These things are also no longer hypothetical, they are visceral. This weekend I saw a video of an entire porch just torn off the side of a house in California and floating down a flooded street. But even so, the magnitude of change that is needed is hard to imagine. And it's often difficult to comprehend what architecture can do, in part because it's going to require much more than architecture alone. Policy, for one. We're going to need the widespread reorientation of our economy. We're going to need a totally new relationship between human, society, and energy itself. So all of these things are going to be necessary, and they are all bigger than one building. They're all bigger than one design project. But I would also hold that architecture is more than the construction of buildings, because buildings are not just shelters. They are cultural artifacts. They influence how we see the world. They influence how we move through the world. They choreograph our movements and our relationships. In other words, buildings are directly involved in giving form to human relationships and giving form to human society. So I would argue that if we want to positively contribute to the epochal change that is coming, we have to think beyond the technical questions of energy efficiency and tap into the long-standing tradition in our discipline that uses architecture to propose alternative ways of life and being. Now, a word of caution here, or perhaps a caveat, because if I'm starting to sound like I have delusions of grandeur about architecture, let me make one thing very clear. The power of architecture is neither good nor bad. It simply is. And part of what I'm trying to argue today is that there is as much power in a radical project as there is in a conventional apartment building, in the sense that the conventional building, both as an idea and as built form, writes social conventions and economic formulas into space. So for example, this project embodies very specific ideas about development, about the production of wealth, about the nature of the economy. Also, through their internal spatial structures, buildings embody specific ideas about cohabitation, about who should live with whom, and how. In other words, buildings sort and organize relationships, helping to determine the basic social unit that constitutes contemporary society. Architecture is always doing the work of holding social form. So perhaps the key to my argument lies in this point, that sometimes we say architecture has no power because it's not obvious how it might immediately change the status quo. But perhaps architecture's power doesn't lie in its ability to spark immediate change. Perhaps architecture's power lies in its ability to hold form. And that holding is powerful. And maybe any project that seeks to address the climate crisis actually has to fight against that power of architecture. So this is why the focus of my research for the past few years has been on something that I like to call carbon form. Because in a sense, I want to better understand what we are up against. So let me briefly define what I mean by the term. At its most simple, it can be defined as the spatial paradigm that emerges from our current mode of energy capture, which of course, as we know, is based on the burning of fossil fuels. So the basic concept is that when our energy paradigm changed, our ideas about space changed as well. Now, without going too deeply into the history of energy transition or the differences between different energy paradigms, I think it's enough for now to say that fossil fuels are a unique and a spectacular energy source. We know this. And when they were widely adopted, many things changed, two of which were particularly important. Our capacity for production changed and increased, and we began to move through space differently. So these were massive socioeconomic and spatial changes. And one of the effects was a burgeoning of new typologies that needed to house these changes. So, of course, shopping malls, department stores, skyscrapers, suburbs, these are all typical of the 20th century, but we've continued to see carbon-form typologies evolve as fossil capitalism has evolved. Airports, transit hubs, factories, offices, distribution centers. Another effect was the emergence not only of building typologies, but also of new urban archetypes. Ever-expanding grids, towers in the park, suburban sprawl, the exuberance of neoliberal urban development, a kind of Manhattanism a la Koolhaas that is the hallmark of the ever-growing metropolis. Now, some of these images that I'm showing you here are massive urban conglomerations, others are generic types. Many of them do not have specific architects as authors. But I do want to implicate architects specifically in all of this, and argue that for a time, carbon form was an explicit architectural project. And let me explain what I mean by that. The early stages of carbon form were very chaotic. These are etchings of Victorian London, where the demographic shifts that were associated with the enclosure movement and the rise of factory labor transformed the city almost overnight. But at the beginning, and especially at the urban scale, these changes were haphazard and they lacked intention or an overall vision. The city was kind of out of control, and it was growing and changing as capitalists and factory owners were pushing this new economic regime with all of the power that was unleashed by fossil fuels. But eventually, carbon form became an architectural project because modernism reacted directly to this condition of the 19th century city. So often it's tempting to think of modernism as a blanket rejection of the past, but I would argue that that's not actually true. Modern treatises on the city were full of references to ancient cities and to classical architecture. The modernists are largely concerned not with history in general, but with the 19th century city as a problem. So this is an excerpt from Hilbersheimer's book, The New City, and you can see the captions here. On the left, you're seeing a traffic jam, and on the right, you're seeing the skyline of New York, and he describes it as disorder and chaos. Right, so he's pairing this image of the skyline with the traffic jam to show that the built environment has this chaotic feeling to it, and that the industrial processes that are happening here and industrial scale consumption are blossoming within a pre-carbon spatial structure, and it's not working. So against this, his project is one of reorganization. So he begins to propose new formal structures for the city that are making room for industrial processes and carbon-based mobility. So on the left, you see Hilbersheimer's project for Manhattan, and on the right, you see a proposal for the eastern United States. Those are not highways, those are a single settlement pattern, a kind of ribbon city extending across the length of the continent. This, of course, is present in the work of Le Corbusier as well. Here is a quote. He writes, "In the last 100 years, a sudden, chaotic, and sweeping invasion, unforeseen and overwhelming, has descended upon the great city. The resultant chaos has brought it about that the great city, which should be a phenomenon of power and energy, is today a menacing disaster." And perhaps the most interesting part is what he ends with. He writes, "Since it is no longer governed by the principles of geometry." So what he's saying is that what's lacking is geometry, order, intention, structure. So the problem was not history. The problem was that the cities of the 19th century had a spatial structure that did not accommodate the power and the speed of carbon energy, which is how you get these proposals. On the left, we have some of the drawings famous from the City of Tomorrow and its planning. On the right, we have Hilbersheimer's metropolis architecture. So in other words, these architects are demanding decongestion, let's say, but it's not just about traffic. It's a plea for a new urban form that can accommodate a rising paradigm. It's a plea to make space for a new world order. So there's another passage from The City of Tomorrow that I think is really remarkable, and I'm not going to read it all, but essentially what's happening here is that Le Corbusier is narrating a fall afternoon, and he's walking down the Champs-Élysées, and the traffic has just started up again after a very quiet summer. And he's contemplating this, and he's thinking about how when he was young, the streets were theirs, and they used to sing and play in the streets. And you think that he's going to get nostalgic, right? He's saying now the motors are going in all directions, going at all speeds. But he doesn't get nostalgic. What he says instead is that he begins to be filled with rapture. Rapture filled me, he says. Not the rapture of the shining coachwork under the gleaming lights, but the rapture of power. We are part of it, he writes. We are part of that race whose dawn is just awakening. We have confidence in this new society, which will in the end arrive at a magnificent expression of its power. And he actually goes on. The rhetoric gets even crazier. There's a storm that won't keep to its bed. Everything is kind of on the verge of exploding. But the point is here that he is walking in a traffic jam, and this is what he sees. In the congestion, there is potential. There is power. And so Le Corbusier walks away from this experience ready to destroy the old city and to give form to something new. Because he saw in this moment that the true potential of carbon form had not been realized. And so harnessing this power would from then on become his project. So that's how you get an architect that's willing to take the existing form of the city and tear it open to give it a new form. So this is an architecture of transition, where the project is explicitly to help transition the world from an agrarian paradigm into an industrial one. And urban and architectural form are being directly instrumentalized to bring society into a new order. And the result is that today, we live in a built environment that is spatially choreographed for industrial production and capitalist consumption. And this is one of the reasons why we find it so difficult to enact change, because there is a spatial system that we've inherited that holds the form of those priorities. So it's clear from this that architecture and architectural form specifically have a great deal of power. But my point here, as I alluded to before, is not to rejoice in the power of the modern. In fact, the opposite. My point is that the power of architecture is not always for the best. And in fact, as I said, we might have to work against this power of architecture, especially because once a new spatial paradigm is established, it creates specific patterns that are replicated over and over again. And these patterns begin to disallow other forms of life. So if architecture is to participate in epochal change, we must begin to identify these priorities that have shaped the built environment so far, in addition to thinking what new priorities might be. So this, of course, is not easy. And actually, to add a further difficulty, I'm going to mention one major difference between the modern movement and today, which is that for them, the energy transition had already happened. They had over a century of fossil fuels already at their backs. They had had a chance to already see what the potential of this energy source was. As the historian William Geordie has said in describing the modern period, the architect did not have to conjure the fantastic. He had only to open his eyes to the laconic facts of modern experience around him. For us, it is different. We don't know yet how to change our system. We don't fully know what to replace it with. And yet part of our work at this time is to think about how architecture might catalyze a transition, as opposed to simply accelerating a process that's already heavily underway. So that's a big difference between then and now. So here I would turn to carbon form again, because this is the spatial structure that is actively disallowing and preventing other forms of life from emerging. So these spatial structures have affordances that were developed specifically so that our current status quo could come into being. So if we want to change the system, we have to think about how space might be restructured. And the better we understand the spatial systems that uphold the status quo, the better we'll be able to locate more effective areas of resistance, the better we'll be able to find the cracks, and the better we'll be able to conjure up a counter-project. So I'm going to discuss two case studies that I think will help us understand what we're up against. One is an early example of carbon form, and the other is more contemporary. This is Ildefonso Cerdà's plan for Barcelona of 1855. And I have to say I'm very indebted to Ross Exo Adams, whose wonderful book on Cerdà really helped me understand the importance of this precedent for the history of carbon modernity. I highly recommend that book to everyone. But Cerdà's plan for Barcelona is not usually considered, in the realm of climate problems. In contrast to today's sprawl, it seems almost an alternative. It's dense, it's got mixed use, it's got all these nice things. But the proposal was conceived as a project of carbon-based mobility. The opening pages of Cerdà's text, which is titled The General Theory of Urbanization, begins with a description of him getting on a ferry. And he had already seen a steam engine. He had been to a factory and he had seen a steam engine before. But he hadn't seen a steam engine propelling motion in this way. And it wasn't until he was on this ferry that it dawned on him that profound changes were happening. On the next page, he describes getting on a train. And he's seeing this new kind of mobility. And he's saying, as opposed to the static world of his youth, something else was happening here. You were seeing different classes all in motion, moving together, moving in different directions. And he sees this as the dawn of a new time. And he wants to unleash the potential of this movement. So that would require unobstructed mobility, which is not something that the urban structures of the time afforded. So he starts to think about a different spatial system, which is the grid. Now, obviously, this is not a spatial system of his invention, but it's his specific use of the grid that is notable, or the specific way he's thinking about the grid. Because he begins to conceive of the city as a network of ways. So he coins this term, vialidad, which is often translated to viality. And vías means ways or roads. So he's thinking about how there's perhaps a different notion of what the constituent elements of the city might be. Roads suddenly become primary. They become a kind of skeleton, the primary form-giving element of the city. Because in his eye, what needs to happen more than anything is for things to move through space efficiently. And so the city not only gains a new form, but it also gains a new anatomical logic. Okay, so those are the vías, but Cerdà also recognized that in order to have spaces of unrestricted mobility, the city also needed spaces of stasis. So he talks about the urban block as well, what he calls the intervía. Now, there already was a word in Spanish for block, it was manzana, but he wanted to emphasize the interstitial nature of the urban block. He was thinking about it differently. So he wanted to give it a new term, and also he wanted to point out that the vía and the intervía could be dialectically related. So what happens in the intervía is the aspects of life that are not in motion unfold there. So what you get is a unit of biological life that's totally abstracted from a larger biological, ecological, or energetic context. Because through this grid, all ties between the biological realities of the body and the landscape have essentially been cut, because instead you get this vast gridded territory, which Cerdà imagined spreading all over the landscape. He imagined that eventually the city would kind of take over the countryside, or the countryside would also be gridded in the same way. So you get this kind of abstraction where human life is not necessarily supported anymore through the land itself, but actually by vast networks of infrastructure. So the result is a new kind of spatial abstraction, let's say. And it's not necessarily embodied by the geometry of the grid, but rather by the fact that on one hand you have this infinite network of infrastructure that's indifferent to land and topography, and then on the other hand you also have this bounded and isolated space where life takes place. And both are independent of the biophysical world. Both have no attention to biophysical constraints. The priority is mobility. So this, of course, could not be more different than the agrarian world that preceded industrial society, where the vast majority of humans were directly engaged in their own subsistence. So on the left here is a diagram of the open field system in medieval England. This was the mode of production that directly preceded the birth of industrial capitalism. And in this mode of production, peasants were not only engaged in the cultivation of land, but they actually worked cooperatively to manage both fields and pastures. So if this was a system where social labor was directed mainly towards subsistence, the abstraction of the urban grid emerges as a different kind of system. And so in contrast to subsistence, I think we might start to call it something more like managed sustenance. So the grid as a geometry is not specific to carbon modernity, but nonetheless you can see that the grid is deployed within carbon modernity to enact radical changes in how human life is distributed and organized upon the surface of the Earth. So this logic has endured. This is a suburb in Southern California called Bonita. And you can see that this logic is carried out to an extreme, even though the specific geometry is slightly different. So we have these major arteries drawn here, and you can see that the specific geometry is different, but there's still a via and intervia logic, because you have these major arteries, and in the interstitial space between them, you get these essentially vast tracts of impassable space, which are residential developments. And they're basically isolated areas of social reproduction. And that's not just rhetoric on my part, it's written into the zoning, right? So this area is primarily zoned residential. So the way that you have to move through this landscape, because of these vast tracts of purely residential space full of cul-de-sacs and houses that have no through streets, the way you move through space looks something like this, right? So this diagram shows sites of employment and consumption relative to a residence. So in other words, this is a drawing that is showing the unfolding of a life in this settlement pattern. And what I think is important is that it has a form, right? But going back to this notion of abstraction, I think it's important to also think about how it is, if not abstract, it is at least abstracted, right? The production of food and commodities is not part of this spatial structure. The way in which a human life is reproduced is not shown in this spatial structure. Notably, there are vast productive landscapes elsewhere that sustain life within this neighborhood. So I like this site in particular, and I think it's quite interesting because as far as these things go, you can see very clearly this disassociation, even though there are sites of production quite near. So just to the west, there is a massive port that receives imports from South America and from Asia. Just to the south, you have the border with Mexico, where you have the maquilas and the maquiladoras. You have heavy industrial production. And then just to the west, you have the Imperial Valley, which is a major area of agricultural production. So these sites are relatively close, but it really is the extreme disassociation between these sites that is all the more visceral from having them so close. So perhaps if I were taking this diagram and abstracting it a little bit further, it would look something like this, something that helps us understand the underlying spatial structure of the settlement pattern. Because the life unfolding here really moves between a home, a site of work, sites of consumption, maybe a trip to the park for recreation. But that occurs within a kind of residential field, beyond which, outside of which, are these productive elsewheres, let's say. And what's interesting is that the one point of contact between that exterior and that interior is simply the store, the site of consumption. So what I would argue is that this is the logic of carbon form. And while it's reconfigurable into different specific geometries, we might see suburbs of different shapes, we might see settlements that are more dense or more sparse, I think that nonetheless we can say that we can think about this formally because there's a discernible form to the logic itself. And I think it appears in different settlements of different densities. And I've been working on some of these mobility studies on settlement patterns that are higher density and lower density, and it seems to always be arriving back to this kind of diagram, where production is relegated to that unspecified elsewhere, where land is conceived primarily as a commodity, and parcelized into a non-ecological concept of abstract property. So at risk of over-abstracting, here is this diagram perhaps again, where you really see that movement between home, work, consumption, and there's a kind of interior and an exterior. And what we see as a very important characteristic of carbon form is this kind of extreme separation between residential and productive zones. That nonetheless require an extreme infrastructural integration, and so there's something of a contradiction there. But nonetheless, those vast networks of infrastructure hold that distance, hold the separation between these different kinds of sites. Okay, so let's loop back to the commons. So the diagram I'm showing you here, I would argue, is essentially the opposite of a common project. And I'll bring up that definition again, which is the social practice where a community of users self-governs and manages a resource. So for the most part, in this kind of settlement pattern, we do not own or govern or control or otherwise engage in the production of most goods. Instead, we subdivide space by granting exclusive rights granted to atomized parcels of land via a system of private property. This is a cadastral map of the suburb we were just looking at. So in this conception, there is no ecological totality, there's no ecological reciprocity between neighbors, and in terms of subsistence and livelihood, we are more connected in our daily lives to the infrastructure we move through than to the people who live around us. These are specific spatial concepts where we conceive of space as bounded and property as fixed. And the first step to making room for the commons is to think about land differently. So in this last part of my talk, I'm going to share some of the experimentation I've been doing at Cooper with my students. I've been teaching a course on carbon form there now for about 5 years. And last fall, I was also able to teach a seminar that builds on the foundation of that course with those same students. And this course was focused on spatial and architectural models that might operate against the logic of carbon modernity. So some of the seminar focused on precedent study, and that was very important. So we looked at hunter-gatherer settlement patterns, we looked at ancient Mayan cities, we looked at the Amerindian villages of North America pre-colonization, we looked at hybrid cartographies in indigenous Mexico post-conquest, we looked at garden cities, and we looked at alternative domesticities. But the work of the seminar was also projective. So I'll share with you 2 very important points of departure for the work that we did. One is that alternatives to carbon form cannot begin with erasure, even though our dominant spatial order has to be rewritten. These alternatives have to emerge from within an existing urban context. And that's both because we have to abandon the tabula rasa mentality of the modern, which we know was a mistake, and also because the tabula rasa simply does not exist. And we also have an extraordinary amount of carbon form in existence that we have to contend with directly. So that's one point of departure. The second one is that one of the principal characteristics of carbon form is this disassociation between production and consumption that I just talked about. And so this is why these precedents in particular were so important, because they had a different idea of how those 2 things relate to each other. So in the case of hunter-gatherer settlement patterns, just to give you an example, this is drawn on the left by an archaeologist named Louis Binford and redrawn by me on the right. You can see that people were actually inhabiting their productive landscape, moving through it, living within it, as opposed to what we just saw within our carbon form example, where production is in that unspecified beyond. So in the seminar, we sought to break that isolation from production and recognize that often it's the repetition of known architectural typologies that reinforce or even create that separation in the first place. So when the domestic sphere does not offer spaces to plant, or when you don't have proximities to gardens or forests or bodies of water, or if you don't have access to a workshop, spaces to make and create, then we simply can't make things for ourselves, right? The basic questions of formal affordances. And what we see in the built environment is often direct production is not really an option. And I think it's important also to note that this is important within the larger history of capitalism. In the early industrial city, there was a movement when the labor movement was also starting and fighting for better conditions for factory workers, to start giving workers housing and allotment gardens where they could grow their own food, and that would reduce the cost of living for them. But capitalists were very intentional to make sure that their plots of land were not too big, because if they became too self-sufficient, they would no longer need a wage, and they would no longer need the job. So there's something about the spatial organization of the capitalist paradigm that has had written into it this project of removing people from their direct access to subsistence, which gives somebody a kind of autonomy. So this was important for us in this course in thinking about that. And we wanted to rewrite that relationship to subsistence. But however, rather than introducing new typologies to replace, the apartment building or the brownstone or even the single-family home, we worked instead to introduce architectural fragments that, through their affordances, could create new possibilities for seeing the ground or the landscape or the ecosystems around us as something living and as something that might even sustain us. So commons were, of course, an important part of this, but the attitude was not that we were designing community systems, for those should be designed by a community. Instead, we were asking the question the other way around. If a community system were to emerge here, what would they need? So I'll start showing the work as I talk through this, but students were asking very specific questions, right? So what are the existing spatial structures of the site? How do people move through space? What are the resources that are available? Where are they located? And what possibilities exist for the decommodification of resources? And what kind of architecture or infrastructure could be introduced to facilitate that kind of activity? So as I mentioned, we really were working with this idea of the fragment, and the fragment was important to us because these architectural elements needed to remain open. We wanted to resist creating an inside and an outside, and instead we wanted to focus on sequences and networks and interstices and work surfaces, things that would change the public realm from a passive place of recreation to one in which subsistence activities were suddenly possible in a new way. So the project I'm showing you here focused on ecological intensification in Prospect Park, this major park in Brooklyn, where here strategic species would be encouraged to grow, so reeds and berries, and they would be allowed for them to be harvested. So the architectural fragments here consisted of work surfaces, of storage for canoe rental, also tool rental and storage, spaces for food preparation, and also critically spaces for education. So these fragments would be distributed into the landscape. And so this is the work by one team. This is a second group which focused on fishing practices on the ecological periphery of the city. As you all know, New York is surrounded by water. And this team was interested in introducing a network of piers which included fishing areas, kitchens, and rest areas, and storage. And the idea was that fishing didn't need to be an either or. It didn't have to be recreational or commercial, but rather by introducing processing stations and rentable storage and even rest areas, a gradient of relationships with the ocean might begin to emerge. And so this team was interested in this kind of coexistence of different kinds of attitudes towards these resources. So some might commercialize their catch, others would come and eat it directly, subsisting directly from the water, and others might simply be there to enjoy nature. This is another group that looked at a park network in Queens, and they were looking at the continuity of green space here as a potential network of mobility. And they were introducing this bike building and repair cooperative and beekeeping and foraging and fermenting into their site. And so they went through the same process of locating resources, mapping them out on the site, seeing where they were, and beginning to introduce these architectural fragments that would allow that relationship to the resources to slowly begin to change. This is a drawing that maps out those fragments across the site, and importantly, you start to see a new kind of spatial network emerge. And in particular, this, I think one of the most interesting proposals by this group was a kind of partial building that would straddle the property line, and it would be perhaps owned and managed by the person that lives in the home just on the right side, but it was open to the back, and the beekeeping would occur there, and it would be a platform where these families could begin to sell honey or provide honey to the community. So again, the question is about reorienting our notions of subsistence, but underneath all of that is also a profound interest to me in how this is also a spatial restructuring. So every team made a diagram like this that looked at the basic structures of mobility as they exist, and the possibility of a spatial restructuring that emerges when a different relationship to the landscape happens. And so the idea is that resources begin to actually be decommodified. There's less of a reliance on the store. Perhaps there's even less of a reliance on the wage. And slowly then there's also a political aspect to this, where not just the grip of carbon form begins to be loosened, but also the grip of the hyper commodification of all things, which has been the project of capitalism. So ultimately, the question was, what kind of architecture can feed, enable, engender, foster, encourage, and otherwise support the emergence of new practices that are so often prevented by the very spatial organizations that we live within? So ultimately, what I hope that this work can do is to begin to suggest a rewriting of the relationship between home and territory, and begin to contest that logic of separation and subdivision that is so problematic and dominant within our current spatial order. And of course, this is simply a seminar, and the work was done in a short 6 weeks. And so there's much left to ask. But I think that this slide is important because it really shows a project of spatial thinking that is embedded within this. So to conclude, if I had to summarize everything, I would simply say that at the core of the climate crisis, there is a spatial problem. And architects are in a unique position to address it, because our way of seeing space and knowing space and shaping space is different than other disciplines and professions. And again, this is not about having an overinflated sense of our importance. In fact, it's simply to recognize the role that the built environment has played in getting here in the first place. And if anything, perhaps we bear a little bit more of a responsibility than others in trying to turn things around. And we also have to recognize that the power of architecture is to make room and to give form. This has been used in favor of carbon modernity up until this point. But because the architecture of the past few centuries shows that architecture can give form to a new emerging social form, I assume that we also now have the power to give form to something else. Thank you very much.
Really provocative talk, thank you very much. And I really appreciate your placing architecture in a role that has real agency in making big changes. And I think that's a really important thing to do, and I think as architects we should be thinking about ways that architecture can retain agency in broader problems. I think placing the role of form and aesthetics within that is also really important. But as I was listening to the talk, and now that we're at the end of it, the issue that I don't have an answer to is scale. You know, there are 8 billion people on the planet. How much sustaining ability do these alternatives that you're proposing have? So for instance, other studies have argued that a city like Hong Kong, which has massive density and lots of distribution of labor, are the answer because it's the only one that we can be efficient enough to survive. You're arguing for a kind of de-densification, kind of engagement with the local landscape, all of which sounds great, but I wonder how many people can that really support? You know, one Costco and the combined acreage that is needed to support it can support this number of people. How many people can kind of de-densify build with a beehive and a fishing pier? You see what I mean? It seems that this is a very provocative local solution, and I wonder, given the kind of global implications of the carbon form diagrams that you show, how much is it possible for this to scale up such that it can operate at the kind of with the kind of global impact that your earlier examples offer?
Yeah, that is a great question, and one that I think about every day. And the question is about scale, for those who maybe couldn't hear, and what is the possibility of, or what are the possibilities for these kinds of proposals to scale up, given the urgency of the problem, the scale of the problem, the scale of the project, which is quite small, right? So there's a kind of disjunction between the scale of the project. And I wouldn't deny that disjunction. I think my position is also that it's all hands on deck. To me, this is not mutually exclusive with Hong Kong, right? And I think that there have to be different kinds of proposals, and I think all of us have to be working on this in our own way. The reason why I personally have gone down in this direction is because in my own studies of climate change, what I keep returning to as its fundamental cause is not just exorbitant energy use. That is a symptom of a deeper cause, which is how we've structured society. And so when we really think about modes of production and when we think about how we reproduce a human life, all of these questions emerge about commodification, about how we actually gain access to our means of subsistence, that to me are not solved by density. And that's actually the emergence of this, if I can go back to the little triangle diagram, this one. In many ways, this diagram emerged for me as I was struggling with those very questions actually, and realizing that in many cases, a dense settlement pattern had this same diagram. And so what do we do about that, right? The spatial footprint of New York is global, right? New York, yes, it's efficient and it has a lower carbon footprint than most places, and it's lucky to have hydropower, so New York's kind of pats itself on the back all the time. But its global footprint that is needed simply to reproduce all the lives there is enormous. And so I think that for me, the project that I'm trying to work with is not solving all the problems, because there are too many for any one project to take on, but to work on the specific problem of that restitching. Because I think that in my own study of the history of energy transition, which is intimately tied with the history of capitalism and understanding the emergence of capitalism as a system, that separation between production and consumption was explicitly part of that project. So I'm really seeing it as something that is not something that happened kind of along the way. It was explicit, like the example that I gave of the factory owners not wanting to give workers an allotment garden that was big enough because then they wouldn't need a wage. So there are all of these larger political and economic projects that are embedded within our energy system that also have to be tackled. And so I'm also trying to think about decommodification, and I'm trying to think about how we might not just reframe notions of subsistence as having a lower carbon footprint, but also being a kind of project of liberation, right? That we no longer have to just work bullshit jobs, to use David Graeber's term, because that also is a way in which the system produces all this excess carbon. We just have to have people working all the time to keep the engine running. And so part of this to me is also about taking away that attitude towards the engine has to be running all the time. Everybody has to have jobs. We have to, even that's my problem with some of the Green New Deal legislation. It keeps that jobs discourse. An energy transition can create jobs. But I think we have to fundamentally transform our relationship to land at a deeper level. And so I don't think that these projects here are necessarily, let's say, the solution, but I think they might hold seeds for something that's a deeper transformation. And so perhaps there are projects for densification that will have higher benefits in terms of carbon emissions than getting a few people in Brooklyn to go around the pond and gather some reeds, although that sounds like a nice Saturday. But I think it's looking for that seed for something deeper, not bigger, but deeper. And so that's maybe the origin of this project. So I recognize that in many ways these projects are very humble, but they're trying to look past something that we're not always looking at, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I was wondering if you're thinking about rules. You mentioned that one of the ways in which the presidential form has been replicated in the landscape is through zoning, right? It's not just the popularity of the form, it's also people got some rules in place. And I was wondering if the fragment sort of proposals that you were suggesting here, I was wondering if you or your students are thinking about rules around their use or abuse, and one of the reasons why I ask that is if you're, seeking to challenge a system as profound and institutionalized as capitalism, abuse or co-optation is a risk that is ever present, right? If we look at, I was thinking about during COVID, a lot of cities relaxed rules for the use of public space, right? We saw a lot of temporary installations on sidewalks, and recently there was a lot of optimism around community use, and in my anecdotal observation, I saw a lot of private use. of realm,
Yeah.
In an absence of rules, frankly. In a way, capitalism co-opted, seemingly interesting fragments of architecture that potentially had a broader set of uses, but ultimately didn't achieve those. So in light of that, perhaps concern of mine, I was wondering if you're thinking about rules associated with these fragments and how you seek to achieve the sort of challenge to capitalism that you're
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think because this was a seminar, in many ways, much of this, within the context of this work, was left unresolved, just due to the nature of the kind of course that it was. And I'm supposed to repeat the question. The question is about rules and whether there are sort of specific rules that we developed around the use of these fragments, and you express a very valid and important concern around co-optation, whether it's the co-optation of capital, of certain kinds of resources, or simply like the examples during the pandemic of private co-optation of public space with the loosening of certain rules. I should say that one of my colleagues at Cooper always rants about the restaurant shacks in New York, and she says that it's the private takeover of the public realm, and so she'll be very sympathetic to your question. But I think that this is an important question, and I don't necessarily have an answer relative to the specific projects. I think within the scope of our conversation, much of our research really focused on trying to define and redefine subsistence. And we were doing typological studies, and we were looking at precedents that were kind of thinking of alternative ways of thinking about these things. But if there was a conversation around rules, it actually it was embedded within a conversation about the commons. And that's actually why I started with the definition of the commons that I did, that Eleanor Ostrom and Massimo De Angelis give, because one of the things that they talk about all the time is that commons are not, if they're not a free-for-all, they have very strict rules, actually. And to get commoning projects to work successfully, there have to be rules. They're this kind of very difficult collaborations, and many of them fail because it's difficult to work together. So we did have conversations around those kinds of things. And so the fishing pier project, actually, we did have a lot of conversations about rules there, because that project was really interested also in just thinking about occupation of space in a totally different lens that was not public versus private. And they wanted this kind of gradient. And so they included they were calling them rest areas, but that didn't mean a bench. They were actually places where someone could sleep. And so that led to a very interesting debate around that, because obviously, the city is constantly trying to get people not to sleep in public. They're constantly trying to figure out how to get rid of homeless people as opposed to shelter them. But then there was a question of, okay, you might take a critical position against that, but then how do you even regulate these spaces? How do you keep them clean? Who is managing them? So those are the questions around rules that came up for us. And I think maybe going back to Todd's question, I think we're accustomed to a lot of top-down regulation, and we kind of look to that to keep space organized. But again, if there's a seed to something that is an alternative to that, in these kinds of projects, and maybe some of my own research that I've done on community land trust, is the emergence of a mid-scale institution that might have a different set of rules. And something that is in an interstitial scale between the individual and the municipality or the state, which I think is a scale that is missing, and a lot can happen at that scale. And so with my firm Outside Development, one of the projects that we did in the past few years was to work with a community that wanted to start a community land trust. And we were trying to think about how far they could push communal ownership of land. And so it was an amazing opportunity to talk directly with a community that wanted to rethink how stuff got done. And what we found is that there were so many things in the neighborhood that they needed that were too big for an individual to take on and too small for the municipality to worry about. And so I think there's something about that interstitial scale that to me is also part of the project, both in my work and in some of the student work, and has also to do with, when we think about what we are giving form to, like I don't want to have this grandiose idea that architects have to think of all of the ways in which humans might live and then we make form and force people to live into it. There are already all these ideas out there, right? And so this is my interest in community land trust. This is my interest in pre-modern communities and pre-modern settlement patterns. There are already different ideas that we can give form to. And to me, that kind of interstitial institution, that third scale, third sector housing, it's like all of that stuff has really interesting potentials, but they don't fit into the dominant economic logic. and they don't, the kind of spaces that those things produce are not beneficial to the real estate industry, to the AAC industry, et cetera. So they don't get the space. So my interest is in making room for those kinds of things, and then maybe those things can kind of begin to emerge. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
I think one of those guys that just stood up and asked a question about whether
I'm interested, I mean, we generally focus on urban context with this, but I'm sure your work has had a lot of dialogue with agrarian societies and rural societies. How does this impact the dichotomy between those two spaces or kind of things, in your opinion? I mean, because I wrote down the words like Jeffersonian and agrarian. I don't think this idea of combating or proposing an alternative to carbon reform necessarily has to meet any of those things or de-urbanizing, but how does that kind of interplay there? Because the rural situation is the same in terms of lack of abilities for instance as the urban situation.
So is your question that, is it necessary to do away with the urban-rural dichotomy? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Or?
Yeah, or what do you think, how do you think moving away from carbon reform impacts the rural-urban dichotomy?
Okay, how it impacts the dichotomy. Okay. I think that my answer might be, again, related to this question of top-down that we've been discussing, because the thing that we saw in the 20th century and with the modern project was this belief that certain ideas could be applicable everywhere. And I think that if we're actually going to begin to shed some of the abstraction that we see in these systems, or the abstractedness of them, then we have to very much pay attention to ecological realities on the ground and the need and the capacity of the community in question, which means that the solution won't be the same everywhere. So I think that the impact of overcoming carbon form on specific places will depend on what the carbon form is in the first place, right? So like a solution for San Diego is going to be different than a solution for New York, which is different from a solution for Iowa, right? So I think that to me, it's more about like understanding that there are certain logics that we have to begin to see, certain spatial logics, and then starting to find how they need to be rewritten based on what we see is happening on the ground. So I think in some cases there will be a need to de-densify so that you can increase access to landscapes. In other cases, we'll need to densify to preserve certain kinds of landscapes, because also we'll recognize that the landscape offers something different. So like we might have a situation where a forest really needs to be preserved as a carbon sink. But we might have other cases where a landscape we might understand as really essential for food production, and so we'll have a very different relationship to it. So, one of the things that I wrote in the Log 47 essay, which was right at the beginning of this project, essentially, it was the first thing I wrote about this, but it was that I didn't feel that this was a project for one architect. Like, I don't feel like this is just my project. Like, I feel like overcoming carbon form is the project of a generation. And so I'm going to have a certain answer to it, but I think it will be different from yours or from anyone else's. And so I think that the other thing that in the end we have to fight for is a kind of heterogeneity and an acceptance of heterogeneity. I think often we look for these totalizing solutions, but that I don't know, maybe perhaps there are too many echoes of the logic of carbon form within that. And so there's perhaps another question about how things replicate and how things proliferate that are embedded in your question, and maybe also in the question about rules. But I think that one thing that has been very influential for me is actually reading about theories of typology. This seems like maybe it's not related to this, but I think it is. Because typologies are replicated. Like, we understand that they have a particular capacity for replication or proliferation. And so sometimes I wonder about how forms, through their legibility or through certain relationships that they create, kind of become easy to replicate. And that's certainly what happened with carbon form, right? Because the affordances of that form had benefits to all sorts of elements of society and of the economy. And certain building typologies were developed for that, right? Like certain housing types were designed to organize and control workers, right? And so typologies replicate themselves. And so I think that there's a certain authoring of new architectural types that might have different affordances, that when we realize that those affordances are worth having, there's a kind of replicability embedded into architecture because of also architectural discourse, the fact that architects talk to each other. So this is also why I think that we have to be constantly having this conversation as architects and thinking about what those entry points might be.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.